For our second presentation this morning, we're still not straying too far from our Frick fold. Susan Grace Galassi, our senior curator here at the Frick Collection, holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, where and here at the Frick Collection, of course, many of you know and have attended with great delight so many of her successful and groundbreaking exhibitions. Among them, and this is just a few, Picasso's Drawings Reinventing Tradition in 2011, co-curated with Marilyn McCulley, Whistler Women and Fashion in 2003 with Margaret MacDonald, and Goya's Last Works in 2006, and importantly for today, El Greco, Themes and Variations in 2001. The Goya and the El Greco both having been organized in consultation with Jonathan Brown. A specialist in 19th and 20th century art, Susan is the author of Picasso's Variations on the Masters, Confrontations with the Past, which was published in 1996. And she's been a contributor to several volumes on Picasso, including the catalogs of major exhibitions organized by the National Gallery London in 2009, the Louvre and the Musée Picasso in Paris in 2008, and the Museo Picasso in Barcelona, also in 2008. Susan has also authored and contributed to countless Frick publications on the collection and special exhibitions. She's currently involved in the early stages of an exhibition on Turner. This morning, though, Susan will present the fruits of her recent research on El Greco with her talk titled Stranger in a Strange Land, A Century of Exhibitions of El Greco in New York. Please welcome Susan to the podium.
Good morning, and thank you for braving the storm. Right outside this door and 12 blocks up Fifth Avenue, exhibitions mark the 400th anniversary of El Greco, one of America's most beloved old masters. The shows are made up of 3 paintings acquired by Henry Clay Frick by 1913, and up the street, 9 from the Metropolitan Museum, joined by 6 from the Hispanic Society. And if they could all be under one roof, this is what the show would look like. The combined tribute of these 3 local museums in New York is New York's response to larger celebrations held last year in El Greco's adopted home of Toledo and in Madrid. It clearly asserts the artist's long-established place in the pantheon of great artists on this side of the Atlantic, as well as New York's preeminent position as an El Greco destination, a place where his entire career is represented. The current display may also be seen as a capstone of a long series of shows of El Greco in New York, dating back to the beginning of the 20th century, when the old master was a relative stranger. Featured in many of these early shows were recent acquisitions then flowing into the hands of a few forward-looking American collectors with a taste for novelty. A look back at a selection of these shows provides insight into the unfolding image of El Greco in New York, through the works that were represented, the changing context in which El Greco was positioned, and through the reactions of the local press. To reconstruct these shows, 2 colleagues, Joanna Shears and Eloise Owens, and I pored over pamphlets and catalogs and scoured exhibition histories to pin down as best we could which versions of works listed simply as Holy Virgin or St. Francis appeared in these shows. This is a work in progress, and much more is to be done. Given the time constraints, I will focus on the exhibitions before World War II. We begin at Knoedler Gallery in 1912, where 4 paintings by El Greco, alongside 11 by Goya, appeared on public view for the first time in New York. Held at the gallery's premises on Fifth Avenue between 45th and 46th Street, the show had a 3-week run in April. By this time, a few dozen works by or attributed to El Greco were owned by Gilded Age collectors, and at least 3 major works by the master had entered museums in Boston, New York, and Chicago. Many American artists had caught the enthusiasm for El Greco, and connoisseurs and critics would have had access to the pioneering studies by Manuel Cosio, August Mayer, and Julius Meyer-Graef. But to the public, El Greco was an unknown quantity and an enigma. The driving force behind this show was Louisine Havemeyer, who, as we well know, with her late husband Harry, was the leading advocate for the work of El Greco and Goya in America. She lent all but 2 of the works by both artists, and the other 2 were lent by her daughter Electra. It would have been a coup for Knoedler to showcase 2 of the greatest El Grecos in private hands in New York in their gallery, which the Havemeyers had purchased through Durand Ruel, while the star power of the strange, new old master served Mrs. Havemeyer to promote her other favorite cause, women's suffrage. These 2 paintings were also included in the selection of 4 works by El Greco. Though small, the New York Times dubbed the exhibition one of the most important shows of the season. The irony of pairing El Greco and Goya with women's suffrage did not go unremarked, and clearly added to the buzz the show generated. Another Times reviewer describes the cardinal as, quote, looking through his horn-rimmed spectacles with such vitality and energy of character that the most militant and courageous suffragist must instinctively quail before that glance. Well, they don't appear to be quailing. Royal Cortizas, a critic for the New York Tribune, found a touch of humor in this situation, noting that, quote, in Spain, if anywhere in the world today, the status of the sex is tinged with medievalism. And it seems a little droll that Spanish art and Spanish types, he's referring now to Goya's Majas, should be chose to plead the cause of women's suffrage. In another more general article in the New York Times, this article addresses El Greco's increasing popularity in this country, noting that there were between 30 and 40 works by El Greco in American possession at this time. The author links his work with modern taste. El Greco's work used to be associated with madness, but that time has passed. We now discover in his work a direct appeal to the emotional and intellectual sympathies of the 20th century. We exalt personality, and he was nothing if not personal. The combination of spiritual gravity with ardor of expression in his work all recommend him to modern taste. In a brief overview of El Greco's biography, the critic continues that despite his foreign origin, he expressed the very soul of Spain, a soul steeped in mysticism, yet clinging to external reality. These themes, El Greco's connection with modernism, mysticism, and with the soul of Spain, are familiar from Romantic writers onwards and the more current influential writing of Manuel Cosio. A second, larger show at Knoedler Gallery, held 3 years later, was pivotal in the presentation of El Greco to American audiences. The show included 15 works by or then attributed to El Greco and 23 by Goya. This show was also a benefit, this time for a patriotic cause during a time of war. The cause was the American Women's War Relief Fund and the Belgian Relief Fund. Mrs. Havemeyer was again involved, but this time only as a lender of 4 works, 2 by El Greco and 2 by Goya. Mrs. Havemeyer again lent her 2 masterpieces. And Henry Clay Frick lent his magnificent St. Jerome, which he purchased in 1905, a year after the Havemeyer Cardinal arrived in New York. And his most recent purchase of a full-length portrait of a Knight of Malta, Vincenzo Anastagi, painted during the artist's Roman period. The Times reviewers cited above lavished praise on the work, focusing on El Greco's gift for characterization. If no other work by the painter were known, it would establish his position with Velázquez and Goya as a master of portraiture. There is more passion in these deep readings of the human soul that can be discerned in most of the painter's religious subjects. We see an inscription on the work that was later masked in 1959, but this is how it would have appeared at the time. In this show, Anastasia was paired with the cardinal for the first and only time. The Times reviewer continues, "It nobly balances the cardinal, striking a graver and more martial art, the same restless research into character, the same vision and freedom of execution." These two magnificent paintings, purchased by Peter Widener and then in his collection, were also in the Knoedler show, as well as these images of saints. A third painting owned by Henry Clay Frick, The Purification of the Temple, was paired with another religious work of equal intensity and expressiveness in the show. The Times reviewer praised their modern phraseology. Cézanne could have read the full significance of these echoing lines and angles in the folds of the garments, the angel's wings, and the sharp clouds. Contrasting with the measured tones of the Times review, Royal Cortizas took a more sensationalist approach, tapping the romantic vein of the artist as a lone genius within an image of Black Spain. Quote, El Greco's central passion is turbid, bitter, like the frenzy of some unhappy man who has passed through undescribable experiences. He is veritably a child of the Inquisition, a ministrant of darkness and pain. Contact with his genius is profoundly interesting as a sort of harsh stimulus. When in the pursuit of beauty we come to him, it is as if the path were full of thorns and the object of our search were fleeing into a no man's land, half hidden from us by drifting mists and distracting lights. None of the works in these exhibitions were for sale. What was in it for Knoedler? As Rebecca Rabineau notes in her comments on yet another benefit show held by Knoedler in 1915, this time there was no Spanish art in it, she says, "These museum quality shows generated publicity and prestige for the gallery at a time when business was slow and highlighted many of the important works the gallery's clients had purchased through them." El Greco's star power in advertising the gallery and promoting particular social causes was not lost on other galleries, which immediately launched their own. The Eric Gallery swiftly asserted their role as the leading dealers in Spanish art in an exhibition of 14 works by 3 artists, 5 by El Greco, 5 by Goya, and 4 by Zurbarán. The author of the pamphlet notes, "While they represent all the Old Master schools, they are best known for their specialization in Spanish Old Masters, and we have had passed through our hands more fine early Spanish paintings than any other gallery in this country. In fact, many of the Old Masters of the Spanish school first became known to American art lovers through exhibitions at our gallery." Frick again lent his Vincenzo Anastagi, which garnered praise from Cortizas, which demonstrated his strong preference for portraiture, which was not uncommon at the time. Quote, "I would give all his religious paintings in the exhibition for Man of Armor, a profoundly Spanish type, beautifully painted and abounding in a certain dour psychological interest." With the help of Marcus Burke, we have been able to identify the other works listed in the pamphlet, which we see here, all 3 of them which were purchased by Archer Milton Huntington and left to the Hispanic Society in 1921. Another exhibition on El Greco was held at the Duran-Ruel Gallery in New York in February of 1916. So far, attempts to track down a catalog or a checklist have been unsuccessful. It appears to have been the first show devoted exclusively to El Greco and the first to distinguish between the hand of the master and his workshop. The show was described in the Times as, quote, "a first course in expertise," noting that there were 5 examples from the hand of the master, and from his studio, listed as El Greco and Prévost, come 13 of more or less interest. Cited in the show are these 2 works, The Feast in the House of Simon and The Annunciation. The only other mention of the show comes from the voluble Tribune critic who commented on the multiple versions of The Feast in the House of Simon. There were apparently 3 in the show. Quote, "In that very changefulness, we draw near to the secret of his ambiguity. He could not think things out. He could feel things intensely, hence the emotional force of the pictures. But before the problems of design, he could only fumble and wait for the happy hit. In that, he was characteristic of a vast amount of Spanish art." Leaving behind the early gallery exhibitions in which El Greco was first presented to New York audiences, we jump now to a new era, the late 20s and the early 30s, when museums took the lead. No longer a stranger, El Greco was by then on his way to becoming a household name. The scholarly focus of these shows reflects the growth of connoisseurship on Spanish art, as well as the rise of art history as an academic discipline. It was in this period, between the two shows, that the Institute of Fine Arts, the Graduate Department of Art History of New York University, was founded with a Hispanist, Walter Cook, at the helm. In both shows, the first held at the Met in 1928 and the second at the Brooklyn Museum in 1935, El Greco is contextualized for the first time within the Spanish tradition. At the Met, El Greco was represented by 13 of the 67 paintings in the show, that also included 7 each by Velázquez and Murillo, 4 by Zurbarán, and 1 or 2 by Mazo, Herrera, Louis Tristan, and Cano. The bulk of the show is given over to Goya, represented by 27 works. The curator of the show, Bryson Burroughs, defined Spanish art as beginning in 1600 with naturalism. Before that, Italian influences prevailed. Caravaggio marked the starting point. Caravaggio revealed to the Spaniards their own surroundings, and the genius of their own Spanish school was born. After 1700, he says, Spanish art went into a coma, to be unexpectedly reawakened by Goya. The Metropolitan Museum already had a collection of Spanish works, though none, except a recent purchase of a Murillo portrait, were included in the show. They remained outside in their own regular gallery. The loans were all from American collectors and from a few museums. Some in the show had been seen in New York before in the 1915 Knoedler exhibition, such as these 2. And many were new to New York audiences, and among the highlights were the paintings that I will quickly go through. The Agony in the Garden, and none of these had been seen in exhibitions before. And they were accompanied by other more minor pieces, some no longer considered to be by El Greco. The Times praised the show, commenting that except for a small showing of old Spanish paintings in Boston 25 years ago, this is the first representative exhibition of its kind in the country. Just 7 years after the Met show, the Brooklyn Museum mounted another survey of Spanish art. The number of works by El Greco rose to 16, many of which had then entered East Coast and Midwestern museums through gift or bequest. Organized by Frederick Sweet, a curator in the Department of Renaissance Art, the show took a broader approach to the Spanish tradition than the Met exhibition, tracing its origins back to the Catalonian fresco painters of the 12th century. Fragments of Romanesque frescoes and gold-ground paintings were included in the show. Once again, we see works that had been already presented in the Knoedler shows of 1912 and 1915, others that were shown in the Knoedler show of 1915, some that had appeared recently in the Met show, such as these 3 paintings, and others that were new to New York, the Pietà and the portrait of a woman from Philadelphia. And I grouped together another series of works that had not previously been on exhibition in New York. The New York Times reviewer found, interestingly enough, that El Greco's work was more stamped by Italian and Byzantine roots, while race and temperament the race and temperament of Spain soared to articulation in the works of Velázquez and Zurbarán. El Greco made a very brief appearance in the World's Fair that was held in New York in 1939 to 40. 3 works by the master were included in an exhibition of masterpieces of art. 3 among, and we see here the beautiful boy blowing on an ember, which had never been seen before by New York audiences, and A Night of Malta, which is no longer attributed to El Greco, as well as the Annunciation, formerly in the Toledo Museum of Art. 1941, the year that marked the 400th anniversary of Greco's birth, saw exhibitions in New York and in the Midwest. The first was another survey of Spanish painting organized by a young Catalan scholar, José Gudiol, a former student of Walter Cook, held at the museum in Toledo, Ohio, sister city of its namesake in Spain. Gudiol, a professor at the university, and others turned it into a leading center for El Greco in America. El Greco was represented by 8 paintings in this exhibition, and Gudiol's catalog was also the first general survey book of Spanish art in the United States. In his chapter on El Greco, mystical readings of the artist give way to clear formal analysis. But before New York relinquished its hold as the El Greco center of the states to the Midwest and Far West, Knoedler Gallery mounted one last show of 17 paintings by El Greco, who was now recruited to a new cause as a defender of democracy. The show was organized during a brief war between Greece and Italy that took place between 1940 and 41. The Countess Maria Mercati, a Greek aristocrat and supporter of the arts in New York, wrote in the catalog that the show was organized to make a contribution to Greece in the heroic struggle for freedom in which she is now engaged, a struggle which incidentally involves the freedom of the whole world, including our own country. El Greco, she noted, introduced into painting the enlightened ideas of a Greek thinker at a time when religious wars and the fanaticism of the Inquisition were devastating Europe, as war is devastating the world today. And he saved the declining art of the Renaissance. Extravagant claims. In the catalog essay, Stéphane Bourgeois, an art dealer and specialist in Dutch masters, connects El Greco with a tradition of fierce Cretan independence, drawing him back to as far as Homer. In entries in the paintings, he finds connections between his work and earlier works created in Crete in his early Byzantine style. In that way, he was rather forward-looking. Unfortunately, this work is no longer, the one that he cites as having a relationship to the icon painters is no longer attributed to the artist. Positioning El Greco as Hellenic rather than Hispanic was not new, as Jonathan Brown notes in his 1982 essay on El Greco's critical fortunes. This, quote, burning issue around 1930, stirred up by the claims of an English critic who was joined in a debate by German, Spanish, and Greek scholars until it collapsed under the weight of its own pointlessness. Returning to Knoedler, paintings in the past exhibitions in New York were brought back, and new ones introduced. Of the total of 17, however, 9 are no longer regarded as by El Greco. The Knoedler presentation marks the finale of a run of shows in New York in the first half of the century in which El Greco was introduced on American soil. Shows on El Greco continued to be organized in the States, in Toledo, Ohio, in San Francisco, and Dallas. Yet the master remained a presence in Gotham. A new generation of artists, among them Thomas Hart Benton, Jackson Pollock, and other members of the abstract expressionist schools, found inspiration in his work, as had the expressionists and cubists in the early years of the century. I'm showing you more examples of the works that were included in the Knoedler show of 1941. The modern era of international loan shows on El Greco was launched in 1982 with El Greco in Toledo, a landmark exhibition organized by the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio. 66 canvases were presented through the collaboration of the Toledo Museum with the National Gallery of Art in Washington, the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, and the Prado in Madrid. Such a show could not have taken place until after the death of Generalissimo Francisco Franco in 1975. The show was held by President Ronald Reagan. The catalog, written by Jonathan Brown, Richard Kagan, Alfonso Perez Sanchez, and William Jordan, set El Greco studies on a new footing in this country, examining his work within the historical and intellectual context of the Toledo of his time. Other large international loan shows, both monographic and surveys, in which El Greco played a larger role, would follow in the new decade, in the first decade of the new century, in New York and in Boston and Durham. I show you here some of the works now from European collections that were seen for the first time in this 1982 major show on El Greco. So the pool of works greatly expands at this time. The following El Greco shows, with which I conclude, are of recent memory, so I'll run through them with little commentary. After a lull of about 40 years, New York again became the center for El Greco activities in the States. In the meantime, major scholarly tomes, such as Harold Wethy's definitive 2-volume book and catalog resume on the artist, had been published. By the late 90s, Jonathan Brown at the Institute of Fine Arts had launched a new generation of Hispanists who were now taking up key positions in the fields of Spanish Golden Age and colonial Latin American art. Jonathan Brown, as a member of the Frick's Council, also instigated a series of small shows at the Frick, highlighting the museum's holdings on Velázquez, El Greco, and Goya. An exhibition of 7 paintings, El Greco's Themes and Variations, brought together the Frick's Purification of the Temple and St. Jerome with other versions that preceded or followed them from collections in the US and Spain. The focus was on El Greco's workshop practices. While the Frick paintings have been constantly on view since the early 20th century, their reappearance to the public in a new context generated a great deal of critical interest and long lines at the museum. Another view of the Frick show. The most significant event of the new century was the largest monographic exhibition of El Greco's work ever assembled. It was organized by David Davies with Gabriele Finaldi, Keith Christensen, and Xavier Bray, and held at the Metropolitan Museum and the National Gallery of Art in London in 2004. Like the 1982 exhibition, the show was intended to situate the artist as fully as possible within the historical and cultural context of his time. New emphasis was given to El Greco's roots in Byzantine tradition and the context of the Mediterranean world of the 16th century in which he was formed. And here are some of the, again, new works that were presented to American audiences for the first time from the Met show. Another revelatory exhibition held at the Onassis Cultural Center in New York in late 2009 and early 2010 focused specifically on El Greco's early development. Entitled The Origins of El Greco, it was curated by Dr. Anastasia Drondaki at the Benaki Museum in Athens. Here, 3 early works by El Greco, which had been shown previously at the Met, were joined by 3 others, all 6 of them painted by El Greco in Crete. That group was placed within the context of 40 holy icons borrowed from churches and monasteries from Greece and elsewhere to show the relationship of the Cretan painters with Western art during the 15th and 16th centuries. With Men in Armor, El Greco and Pulzoni face-to-face, the Frick's curatorial fellow and an El Greco specialist, Jung-Ho Park, brought back into focus El Greco's portrait of Vincenzo Anastagi from his Roman period, that had attracted so much attention in the early exhibitions of El Greco in New York. The painting was shown in a visual dialogue with another portrait of by a leading Italian painter whom El Greco sought to emulate. The Times critic Roberta Smith dubbed the show a stunner, writing, "The exchange of these two portraits ranges across the history and craft of painting, notions of progress and modernity, the role played by context in understanding art, and the matter of how much can be learned by simply looking at paintings as opposed to reading about them." While established today as one of New York's most familiar and well-represented old masters, it was only a century ago that the Greek-Spanish artist from Toledo arrived on these shores as an exotic stranger, taken up by a few collectors with a passion for modern art, such as the Havemeyers, whose enthusiasms spread to others, such as Frick, Widener, and Lehman. Commercial galleries, all of which had played a role in bringing his paintings to America, were the first to make his work available to a wider public. At the same time, El Greco's newness and star power made him a poster boy for promoting a number of causes as diverse as women's suffrage, war relief, and Greek independence. Museums took over by the late 20s, presenting El Greco within larger survey shows of Spanish art. After World War II, the locus for El Greco shows migrated to the Midwest and San Francisco, with Toledo, Ohio playing a key role. The same works were often recycled through these early shows, all from American collections and museums. The first international collaborations of American and Spanish and other European museums began in the early 80s, and a new view of the artist was developed through the influx of loans from Spain, which had not previously been available, and from the rest of Europe. The repertoire is greatly expanded, and with it a turn away from romantic, mystical, and proto-modern views of the artist, which were replaced by an historical approach. Yet, with all this growth of interest and scholarship, one thing remains the same. Just as the Frick's mouse-sized recent show makes clear, that his art remains as vitally alive to us and that his art remains as vitally alive and new to us today as it did when it first arrived in New York. Thank you very much.